Good afternoon and good evening. My name is Victor Vergara from the World Bank. We're very happy to resume our series, the webinar series, based on the publication by the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy, Financing Metropolitan Governments in Developing Countries. This is a joint collaborative effort with the Lincoln Institute and the World Bank Institute. Today we have a unique and very important presentation, one that looks at an issue that has seldom been addressed systematically, and the chapter that in the book provides unique insight. Our presenter is Dr. Anwar Shah. He is director of the Center for Public Economics at Chengdu, Wenjiang, China, and a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings Institution, Washington, D.C. He also serves as an advisor and consultant to the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. He has previously served in the World Bank, Ministry of Finance, Government of Canada, the Government of Alberta, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He has published more than 24 books and numerous articles in leading economics and public economics journals on governance, federalism, local governance, fiscal reforms, and global climate change issues. His recent books include Fiscal Federalism with Robin Broadway by Cambridge University Press, The Practice of Fiscal Federalism, Comparative Perspectives, published by McGill Queen's University Press, Local Governance in Developing Countries and Performance Accountability, and Combating Corruption by the World Bank. Anwar was a colleague of mine in the World Bank and was an incredible resource then and even more so now. The presentation will focus on, as we said, grant financing of metropolitan areas, a review of principles and worldwide practices. The presentation, basically, as a summary, in the new information age, in the globalized and interconnected world, metropolitan areas hold the key to the future prosperity and growth of nations. This presentation takes a closer look at grant financing regimes faced by metropolitan areas and their role in facilitating or hindering improvements in economic and social outcomes of residents of metropolitan areas. A review of 42 large metropolitan areas worldwide shows that, with a few notable exceptions, metropolitan areas in general are hamstrung from playing their potential role in economic advancement. Metro areas have large economic bases and therefore little a priori needs for grant financing, yet they have strong dependence on central transfers. This is because of the highly constrained fiscal autonomy given to these areas, especially in developing countries. With the singular exception of the metropolitan areas in China, such a strong reliance on transfers undermines local autonomy and local accountability. General purpose transfers are formula-based, transparent, and predictable, yet they discriminate against metropolitan areas as they utilize a one-size-fits-all common formula for all local governments, small and large. Such formula typically incorporate equal per jurisdiction component that discriminates against large metropolitan areas. Compactness is rarely rewarded, and the greater needs of metro areas for transportation, education, health, culture, and welfare go unrecognized. And this is especially important in the issue of urban sprawl. Overall, the emphasis in grant financing of metro areas deals with vertical, fiscal gaps, or project-based purpose grants. So without any further ado, I will pass it on to Anwar, who will make the presentation. We will have some structured questions and then open up the floor to our participants. We're very happy that we have a large number of participants, and we would really ask you to participate using the facilities to communicate and ask questions or clarifications. So Anwar, please.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to exchange views with you on grant financing of metropolitan areas. This is in the limited time I have, I won't be able to do full justice to this subject. So I encourage you to read the chapter in the book it's chapter 9 in the book by Professor Ball, Lin, and Wetzel. on metropolitan finance published last year, and because that chapter provides much greater details in terms of the discussions we will have this morning, I'm simply going to highlight some summary conclusions of this chapter. So let me begin uh, by looking at why it's important to look at the metro areas. Metro areas, the allure of metro areas is irresistible for most people, young and young at heart alike, and this is also the importance of metropolitan areas have been enhanced by globalization and information revolution, because now the metropolitan areas are at the are define the competitive edge of various nations, and also they are the centers of excellence in training and center of excellence in knowledge and innovation. They also have issues in metropolitan areas because there are greater degree of crime and violence in metropolitan areas, so that is the downside of it. So the what one would think, given the large base of metropolitan areas, they would not need any grant finance, and they would only need grant finances simply for social services or services where there are externalities or spill out of benefits to other jurisdictions. But as we will see, that's not the case. The metropolitan areas in most countries are heavily constrained in terms of their financing, and they are basically also they have a strong degree of dependence on high level transfers. And the in the OECD areas, the metropolitan areas have greater access to finance, but even there, their existing bases are overtaxed because of unfunded mandates associated with environment, social protection, social services, etc., from higher levels. So overall, why we look at the grants is the design of grants matters in terms of the incentives and accountability regimes it creates. So how the transfers takes place is extremely important in creating the regime at the local level, whether that will be responsive and accountable or not. I will basically go through briefly in terms of the
We will make we're now adjusting the PowerPoint. Hold on, please.
Yeah. So basically in terms of the looking at the grant system, one has to look at the objectives, and one needs to have a single objective, single grant instrument for the type of objective one seeks. In metropolitan areas, there are metropolitan areas where basically where there is a significant degree of self-finance, and there one would be looking at more the in terms of the financing of social services, health, education, social welfare, and other services where there is spill out of benefits like roads, the museums, the recreation centers. But where in most metropolitan areas in the developing world, the main issue is that they don't have enough own financing. So there is a large vertical fiscal gap, and so the question is how that large fiscal gap is to be overcome. And large vertical fiscal gap doesn't necessarily mean the metropolitan areas should receive financing unconditional financing, one should first look at other alternatives that may be more appropriate. And in this case, one needs to look at tax-based sharing or reassigning of taxing responsibility. So some form of tax decentralization. Those options must be explored first before exploring the other opportunities. Then there are also issues in terms of setting national minimum standards, especially for marriage services, education, health, and infrastructure. And there one would think about output-based grants, where you give transfers in the form of with no conditionality in terms of how the monies to be spent, but what is to be expected in terms of the service delivery performance, and for in terms of the maintenance purposes. And for capital grants, one would if the if the metropolitan area has a good fiscal capacity, good credit rating, then one should have a possibility of encouraging them to have capital finance, market-based finance. For areas where there are weak fiscal capacity, one would have conditional capital grants, where the matching rates would vary inversely with fiscal capacity. Now, there are very good examples in this regard in various countries in terms of the setting national minimum standards. And Indonesia it serves as a good examples in the past, where they provided for education and for transportation grants, which are primarily output-based type of grants. And China, Chile, Canada, and Brazil and Colombia still provides this kind of transfers for education, and Canada and Brazil provides for health. And then there is issue of metropolitan. One has to look at the governance of metropolitan areas. Extremely important. Some metropolitan areas are simply unicity metropolitan areas like Toronto. Others have multiple jurisdictions, like with sometimes horizontally coordinated, sometimes fragmented jurisdictions, and some are provincial cities. So it really matters what kind of metropolitan governance one would have in designing the transfer program that would be appropriate. So metropolitan areas where there are fragmented governance and where there are multiple jurisdictions, one can also have type of grants which are called for promoting competition among local governments within a metropolitan area, and those are called either certification or tournament based grants. Certification is you basically provide incentives to encourage certain reforms, and tournament based approaches is you basically set performance standards and reward those better performers. And so this is practiced in tournaments based approaches are practiced in Russia, and certification based approach is being used in Albania. So there is some world experience in this regard, these type of transfers. And then we have transfers for compensating benefits spillovers and local influencing local priorities. So those are the matching grants. Then one needs to have transfers for fiscal disparities, reducing fiscal disparities. And in this case, metropolitan areas where they have multiple jurisdictions, they, either horizontally coordinated or fragmented, they also require intra-jurisdiction equalization, not just equalization from above, from state and provincial level, or from central level, but also the metropolitan itself requires to institute grants within the metropolitan area for equalization. And here there are examples available from Finland, Denmark, Sweden, in terms of the intra-jurisdiction equalization. For inter-jurisdiction equalization from higher level, there are good examples from Canada and Germany in terms of fiscal capacity equalization programs. Now the question is what is the framework, what is one needs to look at in terms of metropolitan finance. I think basically one has to look at the type of services and the kind of characteristics they have, and that will determine what kind of financing one would have. So services with public good characteristics, local good taxes are appropriate, and services with private good characteristic, local charges for services are appropriate, and then development charges for growth. And I already covered the various kinds of transfer systems. And so basically one has to really structure a number of instruments and I should press this. Now, what are the services which are the strong candidates for grant financing in metropolitan areas? Well, this is true uniformly in most countries. These primary and secondary education and public health, welfare assistance, these services are extremely critical in terms of higher level financing. We have an example from city of metropolitan area of St. Louis, Missouri, where this city followed policies. St. Louis was one of the fastest growing metropolitan areas in the United States at the turn of the century, and today it's one of the it was one of the richest area in terms of per capita GDP of local GDP. Now it is no longer. Now it's about 20th in the ranking. How this reversal of fortune came about because city decided to provide a higher level of services, social services, education, health, and especially welfare assistance, and became a very attractive for poor and the needy to flock to this city. And as a result, the city used the taxing business to finance social services. Business moved out of the city, and the city was left with a large burden of social services and an eroded tax base. So this is because of mobility of people, mobility of capital, and the redistributive nature of these services. The higher level finance is extremely important. In fact, for education, primary and secondary education, in even OECD countries, the model, in my view, of financing this education from property taxes is not an appropriate model because of these are redistributive services. So if you are financing them from residential property taxes, there will be richer jurisdiction will be able to afford better schooling than the poorer jurisdictions. So instead, it's more appropriate that the grant financing or personal income tax sharing, tax-based sharing, be used to finance these education and welfare type of transfers. Now, arterial road and regional public transit, another area, and also the National Heritage Museum and Olympic Parks, another area where there is significant spill out of benefits from metropolitan areas to outlying areas. So there is their need for some kind of either matching grants to compensate for spill out either from the higher level or intra-jurisdictional agreements. Like in Finland, there is intra-jurisdictional agreements that compensate metropolitan areas from this kind of situation. Now, Now I have basically already covered the various forms of metropolitan governance, not in detail, but because we don't have time, but in general, and that the governance does matter in deciding what type of grant structure you will be using, and also not just governance, but also one needs to look at the whether there is significant self-finance or not, where there is a large vertical fiscal gap, because that also determines the type of transfers one needs to look at it in various jurisdictions. So let me, and there is also questions in terms of whether how the metropolitan area delivers services, whether that is relevant or not for grant design. If, for example, some metropolitan areas, rather than providing services through their own departments, may contract out services. So, then question is whether or not grant compensation is appropriate in this. Actually, this management paradigm, how the metropolitan area conducts its business, should have no relevance to the grant design. And also, if you have the functional overlapping and competing jurisdictions in a metropolitan areas, then output-based grants are appropriate. And if the metropolitan areas are fragmented by single-purpose jurisdictions, and then the revenue inadequacy becomes extremely relevant for grant design. So the when there is private provision of services, then one has to look at very carefully whether the poor are protected or not, and one must provide grant financing, must take care of that issue. Now, in terms of the grants and own source revenues, one finds wide variations in terms of the metropolitan areas, and some are metropolitan areas like in the Unicity model, the Pretoria and Addis Ababa are self-financed, whereas London, interestingly enough, is heavily dependent on transfers. London, 81% of London's financing comes from higher level transfers, and similar is the case for Melbourne. And so so it's not there is not a clear pattern between OECD and the developing world in terms of the grant financing of metropolitan area. Even in the advanced countries, some of the metropolitan have very limited financing, and under a city state or a provincial type of governance, with two tiers, metropolitan areas, again Seoul stands out. Seoul and Tokyo stands out as almost completely self-financed with little financing, grant financing, whereas Berlin has mostly grant financing, and Istanbul has mostly grant financing. And in terms of the grant financing under horizontally coordinated or fragmented metropolitan governance, horizontally coordinated with mandatory two-tier governance, Copenhagen is the one where it primarily depends on the own source revenues, where other jurisdictions are grant dependent. And for uncoordinated two-tier governance, the most of the areas are grant dependent, and for horizontally coordinated with voluntary two-tier governance, Helsinki is self-financed. So there's a great variations in terms of the and for fragmented single-tier governance. Here some of the India's metropolitan areas come in, and here they have very little self-financing. In fact, some of the richest city metropolitan jurisdictions in the country, which contributes to a majority of the financing for the nation as a whole, like Mumbai, as is has what you call the it's still it has limited financing available, although its grant dependency is much less than other jurisdictions in like Chennai and New Delhi. There's much greater grant dependency. Uh, Washington, metropolitan Washington, is almost completely depend. So no, sorry, it's 1/4 dependent on transfers. So it's like more like Mumbai, um, and the so it's if one looks at in terms of various metropolitan governance and the dependence on transfers, there's really no clear pattern. In terms of there's a wide variations in terms of the high, low, and averages. But the only thing that stands out is that it's the fragmented areas have mostly higher dependence on transfers. And also it's interesting that some of the very, if one looks at the areas where there is greater than 2/3 of financing comes from grants, there are very interesting examples here: Bucharest, London, Berlin, Istanbul, Yogyakarta, Mexico, Madrid, and Zagreb. So some of the very important metropolitan areas are in this list. Now, examples of better practices are very difficult to find in terms of the grant design, because most countries basically institute grants for local governments that has one size fits all, and metropolitans are part of the same formula as are the small towns and the smaller jurisdictions. The exception, clear exception, is the Czech Republic, where Prague is treated very differently than others. And also there are exceptions in terms of the in terms of Denmark and Finland. I'll come later. And there is the examples to grants to promote competition we already discussed. There are two examples I know of: Albania and Russia. Outward-based transfers, there are few examples. In terms of the developing world is Thailand, Brazil, and Chile has these examples. And in terms of the solidarity principle for intra-metropolitan equalization, solidarity principle is you tax the rich jurisdiction and give benefits to the poorer jurisdictions. You make transfers not from higher level to lower levels, but transfers at the same level between richer municipalities to poorer municipalities. So in this case, richer metropolitan areas to poorer metropolitan areas. That is the case for Denmark and Finland. That is how their transfers are structured. And China has an interesting feature that in Shanghai and Beijing, China's taxes are highly centralized, but Shanghai and Beijing, first, they have provincial status. Secondly, they benefit from tax rebates by origin of collection. So 25% of the tax rebate, the VAT collection, is returned by origin to these jurisdictions. However, these jurisdictions receive much less than some of the poorer provinces, like minority provinces and poorer provinces may be receiving almost 100% of the VAT collection by origin. So there are differences. And in terms of the other, in terms of what the practice in general is not consistent with the principles, because there is one size fit all approaches in terms of grant design in most of the world, and there is no recognition of metro governance structure, responsibilities, or the unique character of these. Also, the nature of metropolitan services are not considered, and often there is most, even in the OECD countries, the focus is on, in terms of the conditional grant or specific purpose grant, they are almost all, these are based on the input controls or spending, conditions on spending, and very few grants where there is conditions on the output or the service uh, levels to be achieved. And often there are very complex criteria because they combine all these jurisdiction in one pool. So you, in order to satisfy all, they have to have a complex criteria, and so that criteria leads to a lack of focus in terms of the grant design. And there are no sunset clauses or review provisions, or ordinarily one would expect that these grants program which should have a sunset clause of 3 or 5 years, and then there should be a formal review and revision and continuation depending upon the circumstances. And so other points to note is in terms of the self-financing in metropolitan area is very highly constrained even in the industrialized world, and there are only few exceptions like Tokyo and Seoul are the most important exceptions in this regard. And generally we argued earlier that it's better to have tax-based sharing and tax decentralization. Instead, most jurisdictions practice tax by tax sharing and revenue sharing. And general purpose transfers typically discriminate against metropolitan areas. Spill out of benefits are very rarely compensated. In the some jurisdictions, the exceptions are, for example, in Finland, there are agreements among jurisdictions at the same level to compensate for this. And in the Washington metropolitan area, there has been in the past negotiations to compensate various jurisdictions, and now there is even the district Washington D.C. relies more on parking charges to overcome some of the benefit spillouts. So benefit spillouts are rarely compensated, and project-based, input-based transfers are in vogue almost everywhere, and they undermine local autonomy. And here there are interesting examples of such autonomy being undermined. Comes from Bangkok and Jakarta. In Bangkok and Jakarta, you can see there's are pillars made for the public mass public transit, and without having mass transit in some sections of the city. The reason being that the financing was promised by the central government, and then the local government did its own part, but then the rest of the financing did not come through from the higher level. And in Jakarta's case, the financing came from the Japanese government, but the central government intervened to say that Jakarta cannot directly receive such financing from Japan government. As a result, the project was stalled. So those are the difficulties that metropolitan areas face. Okay. So basically, the metropolitan areas could have greater own source access to own source revenues, and for grants they should be treated separately. They should not be part of the other local jurisdictions in terms of the grant design, and they should be given greater tax autonomy and access to more productive tax bases like personal income tax, sales taxes, and environmental taxes are the appropriate candidates for metropolitan assignments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Anwar. We have a lot of very interesting participants from Pakistan, Germany, Colombia, Macedonia, Canada, Brazil, Argentina. We would like to get your questions. We're going to start off with a few structured questions, and then please type in your specific questions. Anwar, would you like to go through this one?
Okay. What should be the priority of metropolitan finance reform in your view? One is greater taxing power and expenditure autonomy to assure self-reliance. Number 2, tax-based sharing. Number 3, grant financing.
And you can vote now in your computer, and we'll lock the question, and then Anwar will have a few comments, and then we'll go to the next question. So it looks like it's settling in now. We can lock it in. And what do you think, Anwar?
And what should be the priority for reform? I agree with the respondents' perspective. What should be the priority for metropolitan finance reform? Greater taxing power. Okay, this is the uh, greater taxing power and expenditure autonomy to assure self-reliance, tax-based sharing, and better grant financing.
Thank you very much. And this is a very important, I think, principle. Next question is,
how would you characterize grant financing of your metropolitan area? Grants are objective, transparent, predictable, and fair. Grants are intrusive and non-transparent.
and the votes are coming in now from our participants, and it's certainly headed one way. We can lock it in. And what do you think of the answer?
I think it's consistent with our review of the 42 metropolitan areas suggests. Typically, in majority of the cases, the grants are intrusive and non-transparent.
Thank you very much to everyone. And I think this is the most important review of this topic of our metro areas that has been done in the world, and it breaks through with specific recommendations that Anwar outlined. As Anwar mentioned, the greater detail is available in the book. It's available in the website of the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy, which we'll post in our webpage. It's simple. It's www.lincolninst.edu. You can get the first chapter there. You can download it, the summary, and then you can purchase the publication as well. The presentation that Anwar just made will be available online, so you can look at it in greater detail. Anwar, just to kick off the questions, I was thinking about what you said about the solidarity principle, and perhaps it's not directly related to this, although I think it is possibly. You've done some very advanced work on participatory budgeting. And in the case of Porto Alegre, they do have a principle of progressivity in assigning resources within the districts of the city.
Yes.
Would that be kind of although not a solidarity principle, but it is a progressive allocation of grants within a city?
Yes, that's more protecting the poor within the jurisdiction. Whereas these grants are more, across different jurisdictions within the metropolitan areas, how that each jurisdiction within the metropolitan should have reasonable level of public services at reasonably comparable burdens of taxation, so that there are richer jurisdictions like here in metropolitan Washington. There are richer jurisdictions like Montgomery County or Fairfax County that provides much better public services than poorer jurisdiction like Washington DC or the Howard County or several other counties. So it is that this equalization takes place across those jurisdictions, and there are compensation by agreement from richer jurisdictions. They contribute to the pool, and the poorer jurisdiction receive from the pool. So they have to agree among themselves what is the standard of equalization they will accept, because the richer jurisdiction would not want to have a high standard of equalization because they are contributing to the pool, whereas the poorer jurisdiction wants to have a higher standard of equalization. So they reach a political compromise what is acceptable in terms of the donors and the recipients, and that is the case in Sweden and Denmark and in Finland. In terms of how the equalization is done at the intra-metropolitan level.
I think we have a couple of questions from Matt Glasser. Let me take the one that is that is more relevant to the session. It says metropolitan areas are often in opposition to national government. National politicians don't necessarily embrace the ideas of giving them more power. So basically, the political economy of financing metropolitan regions, typically very large and powerful, politically visible. Uh, how is that? How can that be addressed in a systematic way? Although you've already hinted at the transparency and predictability issue.
Which is the question?
Yeah, that would be the metropolitan areas are often in opposition.
National government.
Yeah. So national politicians don't necessarily embrace the idea of giving them more power.
I think Matt is perfectly right. In fact, I have argued, in a globalized and interconnected world, even he has highlighted the national government. I would say the state and provincial politicians are even more aggressive on giving less power to the local governments. The most recent case is the Pakistan. Pakistan recently, through 18th Amendment, completely decentralized all powers to the provincial level. So federal government really is a nominal government, have very limited powers, defense, currency, and so on and so forth. But most powers now belong to the provinces. But as soon provinces got the powers, they basically tried to limit the powers of local governments. So they all amended the Local Governments Act to reduce the powers of the local governments, and they are even reluctant to have the local elections. And the Supreme Court of Pakistan has intervened, and the Election Commission has intervened in terms of the requirement for elections to force them to have elections.
I see.
Otherwise, they are interested in making most of the powers at the provincial level, centralizing power at the provincial level rather than at the local level. So I think in view of this, one needs to have basically for metropolitan area, in my view, they should have a status of a province, like is the case in Korea, same is the case in China, and they should have very similar powers in terms of the taxing and responsibilities like a province or a state. And so that way you are less dependent on higher, basically will of the higher level politicians. So that's the only way to deal with the political economic questions. Otherwise, this tension will always be there.
Very good. We have, I think, a comment, I think, from Pakistan. It says, in Pakistan, we have decentralized powers, but not the tax base, as most hefty taxes are still with the national government. This is Muhaid Hussein commenting.
Well, but in Pakistan, yes, you have the taxes are centralized, and but there is a mandated transfer of these taxes through the National Finance Commission. So, and the provinces used to have these powers of larger powers of taxation. They voluntarily gave them up earlier because by agreement, and I think there is really no reason why they should be given more power, because to create a better internal common market, you need tax harmonization. And Pakistan has already now, with provincialization, created greater barriers to factor mobility, to employment, etc. Because now the powers, provinces have powers in these areas. So already the internal common market in Pakistan is completely fragmented, and there are greater barriers being erected to mobility of goods and factors and people across the nation. So you don't want to decentralize taxation in that environment. In fact, it's better to have a centralized tax system and more objective system of transfers to finance services at the provincial local level. And that way, only that way you can have a common economic union, common political union. Otherwise, there will be the complete fragmentation of the country, in my view.
Thank you very much. Let me go to getting a lot more, many more questions. One from Shashima Nisar, question on can ethnic bias among states be a big constraint for equalization? How may this issue be addressed?
I think ethnicity is an important reason for equalization. You know, it's like in China's case, most of the equalization payments are to the minority provinces. And the minority, like the Tibet, is the largest recipient of these equalization transfers, and the reason is you basically want to keep peace in the country. You want to have various ethnicity at ease with each other. So, see, the equalization payments basically are intended to create that harmony. So, this has to be taken into account. But it is taken into account simply also because of the fact the ethnicity also gets associated with the degree of fiscal capacity and level of economic development in the nation. Some ethnic areas are much more poorer than other areas, so those considerations do come into play.
I guess without sites making a big diversion into Canada, the idea of the fiscal glue
Yes.
is quite relevant for
Yes.
this case. We have a question from Tony Levitas. He says, I was struck by the response of the first structured question, where more than 90% of the respondents saw the primary solution of the problem of metropolitan finance in terms of improving local-owned revenues. When I think of the empirical evidence you have presented, it shows that metropolitan areas in developing countries are necessarily transfer dependent, given their social sector responsibilities. Could you comment on this disconnect?
No, there is no disconnect. You know, simply if you are self-financed doesn't mean you have enough financing. You know, in Pakistan, local governments receive only 5, and also in India. I mean, I find it very ironic in both in India's and Pakistan's case. In India's case, India is one of the world's largest democracy, but local governments accounts only for 5% of the overall consolidated public expenditures, and they elect. There are about 250,000 plus local governments, and they elect more than 1 million officials, and they basically are making, once you make payment for officials and the salaries of the civil servants, with 5%, there's not much left to deliver public services. So the issue is, and whereas in India, most local governments, and in Pakistan are self-financed, but they have very little financing available. So the issue is not, so the self-financing doesn't capture that issue, because you may have access to very limited basis, and on top of that, you don't have much transfers. And whereas what I am arguing is they should have they should have home rule in terms of what the local governments, the kind of services they want to deliver, and they should have autonomy in deciding on the tax areas within certain framework legislation. In terms of the higher level can decide on the kind of basis, so that the bases are relatively uniform across jurisdictions, but local government should have significant autonomy in terms of the level of taxation, in terms of the tax rate, and that is missing in most of the countries. And tax-based sharing is not very common, and most of the time these local governments are dictated how much tax rate they can levy, what is the base they have, and they have access to most of the unproductive tax bases available. Most of the productive tax bases are at the higher level.
Thank you very much. Robert Daughters has been typing in a question that's now come in. Former guru in the IDB Robert Daughter writes, is your position that metro jurisdictions don't, on average, have potential for financing their services with their own source revenues, despite their housing each country's principal economic base? That is to say, they are the economic base of the country. So what is your position on metro jurisdictions having or not having capacity for financing their own their expenditures?
Well, there the role of the equalization comes in. If there are certain metropolitan areas would not have the sufficient economic base, so there the role of the equalization comes in to equalize to have some minimum standards of public services across various metropolitan areas. Uh, but the other is if there is accountability in the system. Like what I like about the China system is that they have this criteria, which is an imperfect criteria but a useful one. Local economic development. There they use two criteria in promotion of officials, and the local economic development and citizen satisfaction monitored through complaints against local government. So those criteria to me is very useful. I mean, because now local governments have an incentive to advance local development, and they look for very innovative ways in advancing local development, as China's past 3 decades of history has shown. China had a restriction on local borrowing, but how can you grow if you don't have enough infrastructure facilities, appropriate social and physical infrastructure, and you cannot finance it from current revenues. So you need access to borrowing. So there you used innovative ways, setting up investment corporations to overcome this restraint on borrowing.
So the question in China, the citizen satisfaction is a relatively new component of their criteria. No, I mean they were mostly geared towards more productivity outputs than.
Yes.
So they have made an important adjustment to their.
No, they are making actually even more adjustment. Now they are bringing in the more comprehensive criteria in terms of the social services, and social inclusion. Because the problem in China was the focus on growth alone led to basically the neglect of environment, neglect of the migrant labor. So it led to social exclusion, and it also led to urban sprawl because the local governments could simply capture land from farmers at agricultural prices, then overnight resell it, lease it to the commercial developers at fairly high urban use prices, and make in the process huge amount of profits.
That's correct.
And now they are bringing in criteria of social inclusion in terms of the environment and the access to social services, taking care of the migrant labor. So these are the kind of things they are thinking about. Yes, these are the newer factors that
important adjustments. Yes. I guess we're going to have to wrap up, but before that, there's a question from Shashima Nisari. So it's a fairly generic question about the sequencing of decentralizing fiscal resources versus, and then when do you empower for capacity and autonomy of local governments?
In my
short
view,
response for that.
In my view, capacity is a red herring in all this decentralization literature, because look at the capacity of the local governments in China versus the capacity of local governments in India and Pakistan. I'm talking about technical capacity. Technical capacity in India and Pakistan was always higher than in China, even now. And if you look at even now the budgeting practices in China, they are primitive at the local level. But those people perform outstanding in terms of the service delivery, because there is a commitment to serve people, and requirement that you must demonstrate growth and economic development. So the accountability is for results in China, whereas the accountability is diffused in India, Pakistan. There is no accountability at all in terms of the results.
So governance matters in finance.
So the governance is extremely important, and that is where the grants come in, because if you have output-based type of transfers, you bring in service delivery performance accountability on the table directly, and these are not intrusive. You basically respect local autonomy, give them flexibility, whatever they want to spend money, but at the end they are held accountable to maintaining certain quality and standards of services and delivering those within the based on the available resources. So that is, to me, is the most critical element that distinguishes well-performing governments from the poorer performing governments.
Thanks very much. We have run out of time. I think that it's clear. I think the messages of the chapter are clear. There are some very clear indications of what works and what doesn't. Although there is also a diversity, I think the richness of the data is powerful. As the world urbanizes, it also becomes more metropolitan. The cities become more multi-jurisdictional. So the importance of metropolitan finance or inter-jurisdictional finance of urban extents are fundamental and are going to be critical to making cities work. So I think this chapter that you have prepared is of great importance, and we will continue the dialogue as we go on. Thank you very much, Anwar, for the presentation.
I'm extremely appreciative of the comments. We didn't have the time to really reflect on those comments. But the time is so short for this webinar.
That's right. But I think we will post the presentation and the video recording on the E-Institute website. We will follow up with the unanswered questions as well. We want to thank everyone who joined: Tony Levitas, Abdu, Agustin Maria, Fatima Shah, Jose Luis Acero, many others across the world from many continents. So thank you very much for joining, and words of appreciation are coming in from everywhere for Anwar's presentation. We apologize for last week. We had a snowstorm in Washington. We had to reschedule our presentation with Richard Bird, distinguished professor emeritus from the University of Toronto. He will be with us on March 4th. And next month we will have country presentations, city presentations, now getting to the specifics of how metro regions are working. Mumbai, the 11th of February, and the case of China on the 25th of February. Thank you very much for all your participation, and we're now going to have a small survey for your feedback. Please join us again in this series, which is creating a great deal of knowledge among you. Thank you very much.